He rose with hope, led with power, and carried the weight of a divided nation on his shoulders. Welcome to the story of Barack Obama, a journey through power, pain, and the price of legacy. Before he was the face of hope, before the stadiums, the speeches, the slogan, "Yes, we can," there was just a boy who belonged everywhere and nowhere, a boy born in paradise, but raised in questions. Barack Hussein Obama II was born on August 4, 1961, in Honolulu, Hawaii, a place already set apart from the American mainland, isolated in beauty and distant in politics. But Obama's journey wouldn't be confined by location. It was shaped by bloodlines, loss, race, and a hunger for belonging that would haunt him for years. Two worlds collide his father, Barack Obama Sr., a brilliant, ambitious man from Kenya. His mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, a curious, compassionate white woman from Kansas. Their union wasn't just interracial, it was improbable. And from that improbable love came a child caught between continents, cultures, and expectations. Barack's father would leave when he was just a toddler. For years, he'd be more myth than man. A ghost in photographs, a question mark in bedtime stories. That absence would become one of the most defining presences of his life. Indonesia, the first break. At the age of 6, Barack moved with his mother and stepfather to Jakarta, Indonesia. It was 1967. Political unrest echoed through the streets. But for young Barack, the noise wasn't just in the air. It was inside him. He lived among chickens in the yard, studied in schools where few looked like him, and learned a new language, Bahasa. He witnessed poverty up close. He was American. He was not. He was black. He was not. He was different. And even he didn't know exactly what that meant. Return to Hawaii. The grandparents who stepped in. By age 10, Barack was back in Hawaii. His mother stayed behind in Indonesia, but he was sent to live with his maternal grandparents, Stanley and Madeline Dunham. They gave him stability, a bed, books, breakfast, and belief. But still, the questions followed. At school, he was the black kid in a mostly white classroom. At home, he was being raised by white grandparents who tried to understand but couldn't fully relate. One day, he overheard his grandmother confess she was afraid of a black man at a bus stop. Barack was shattered. Not by racism from strangers, but by the realization that it lived in the people he loved. The identity war. Within Barack began to read, to think, to rebel. He smoked weed, skipped classes, and drifted through high school. But under it all, a search for answers, for anchor, for truth. He read Baldwin, Ellison, and Malcolm X. He explored what it meant to be a black man in America, even as he grew up in one of the least black places in America. He once wrote, "I ceased to advertise my mother's race at the age of 12 or 13, when I began to suspect that by doing so, I was ingratiating myself to whites. There was pain in that, but there was power in it too, because through the confusion, he was forming something deeper, empathy. The kind of empathy that would one day win over red states and blue, but back then, it just made him feel alone. The ghost of his father. His father only visited him once, when Barack was 10. A man in a suit, a visitor, a shadow. They spent just a week together. Then he was gone again. Then, dead. Barack would never really know his father, but he would chase his image. He would write about him, study him, and in many ways, run from his mistakes. His absence became Barack's paradox. The man who gave him his name, gave him no direction, and yet shaped everything. Set up for the next chapter. Before he was the leader of the free world, Barack Obama was just a boy with too many questions and not enough mirrors. But every piece of his past, Hawaii, Kenya, Kansas, Indonesia, became the puzzle that would one day fit into history's frame. And as we turn the page to the next chapter, the boy who didn't know where he belonged decides to become the change he once searched for. Let's shift gears. What truly shaped Obama wasn't just where he came from. It was what he chose to learn, question, and become. If this story is resonating with you so far, tap that like button. It means more than you know. Now, we enter part 2, Education and Intellectual Awakening, where the seeds of transformation were planted and a future president began to take form. Before he led the free world, before the Nobel Peace Prize, before the chants of "Yes, we can" echoed across stadiums, there was a young man carrying the weight of many worlds, racial, cultural, ideological. Barack Obama was not born into certainty. He was sculpted by questions. Occidental College, the spark of awareness. In 1979, Barack Obama enrolled at Occidental College in Los Angeles, far from the palm trees of Hawaii and the turbulent streets of Jakarta. Here, he was Barry, not senator, not president, just Barry, an identity still under construction. Occidental was small, liberal, and intellectually restless, and it was here that Obama first felt the crackling of activism beneath his skin. It was the post-Vietnam era, but the embers of protest still smouldered. He was introduced to political theory, black literature, and race dynamics in America. He started attending anti-apartheid rallies and felt, for the first time, the responsibility of history leaning on his shoulders. It was at Oxy, he later said, that I began to ask myself questions about how the world worked and how I fit into that world. But he felt something else too, a dissonance. He felt like an outsider peering into his own awakening. He knew he had to go deeper. Columbia University, silence, solitude, and self. In his junior year, Obama made a decision that would alter his trajectory. He transferred to Columbia University in New York City. This wasn't just an academic move, it was a migration inward, a search for identity through solitude. At Columbia, Obama lived like a monk in a temple of books. He walked the streets of Harlem and Upper Manhattan with headphones on, carving thoughts into notebooks and paper napkins. He read Baldwin, Du Bois, Marx, Fanon. He consumed the world not through television or conversation, but through intellectual hunger. He wrote poems. He debated ideas in cafes. But more than anything, he wrestled with himself. How do you lead when you're still learning to follow your own voice? How do you belong to a country that struggles to see you? That time in New York was not glamorous. It was quiet, almost invisible. But it was transformative. Obama wasn't building a resume, he was forging a philosophy. Harvard Law School, the rise of the voice. Then came Harvard, arguably the most prestigious legal institution in the world. But Barack didn't walk through those gates with arrogance. He walked in with purpose. It was here, in the late 1980s, that the country was watching a rising tide of racial tension, police brutality, and class inequality. Harvard was no bubble. It was a crucible. And in this crucible, Obama did the unthinkable. He became the first black president of the Harvard Law Review, a moment that stunned academia and made national headlines. But he didn't seek the title for fame. He sought it for impact. He used his position not to dominate, but to unify, inviting conservative voices into the conversation, challenging dogma, and building consensus in a world obsessed with division. Professors were amazed by his balance, the intellect of a legal scholar, the empathy of a community organizer, and the rhetorical fire of a preacher. It was at Harvard where Obama became a bridge between black and white, left and right, elite and everyday. Mentors saw something rare, not just brilliance, but restraint. They saw a leader rising, quietly. Ideological evolution, from books to people. But what truly defined this chapter wasn't his grades or his achievements. It was his internal evolution. He no longer saw politics as theory. He began to see it as a vessel for service. He wasn't interested in arguments that ended in applause. He wanted arguments that led to action. Obama began shaping his belief that policy must meet people where they live, in their kitchens, their jobs, their grief. And so the boy who once stared at the absence of his father, the student who wandered the streets of New York looking for meaning, the law student who sat in circles where people rarely looked like him, had now become a man who could speak to everyone. Not because he had all the answers, but because he'd spent years living the questions. This was no longer Barry from Hawaii. This was Barack Obama, a man armed with knowledge, shaped by pain, driven by purpose. But the story doesn't end here, because the moment he found his voice, he had to choose where to use it, and that is where part 3 begins. Chicago's South Side didn't welcome Barack Obama with open arms. He was just 24, a skinny kid with a strange name, Ivy League polish, and a borrowed belief that he could help. But the people here, they'd heard promises before, from politicians, from pastors, from non-profits, and now from him. At first, Barack didn't speak their language, not literally, but in tone, in presence, in authenticity. He was polished and academic, quoting policies and structural change. But the people on the South Side didn't want theories. They wanted someone who'd sit in their living rooms, drink their weak coffee, and listen. And that's when it all began to shift. He started walking the neighborhoods, not to fix them, but to understand them. He attended community meetings where frustration echoed louder than hope. He watched mothers beg for better schools, fathers speak about vanishing jobs, kids dodge gangs just to get home safe. In those crowded, dimly lit church basements and neighborhood centers, Barack began shedding the weight of idealism and learning the art of empathy. He learned that true leadership wasn't about speaking first. It was about listening long enough to feel someone else's pain. It was there he learned to speak, not like a professor, but like a neighbor. He dropped the legal jargon and picked up human language, the kind that touches a heart before it ever tries to win a mind. He organized job programs. He helped tenants fight slumlords. He helped church leaders unify around local issues. And when projects failed, because many did, he stayed. That mattered more than any win. He was being shaped by failure and faith in equal measure. But behind the public work, there was private turmoil. He still wrestled with the ghost of his father, the questions about his blackness, his Americanness, his place in a world that didn't quite know what to make of him. And in that internal storm, the streets of Chicago offered an answer. Show up anyway. One woman, an elder in the neighborhood, once pulled him aside and said, "You think too much, but you love just enough to matter." That stayed with him, and so did the pain. He witnessed systems so broken they seemed engineered that way. He saw children being failed before they could read. He saw grandmothers raising grandkids while their own sons vanished into prisons or graves. Chicago didn't just teach Obama about politics. It taught him humility. It taught him resilience. And it taught him that change doesn't start in Washington. It starts in circles of folding chairs, in crowded living rooms, in tired hands holding protest signs. Barack wasn't a savior in Chicago, but Chicago, it saved him. It grounded him. It tore down the illusion of quick fixes and replaced it with something far more valuable. The quiet fire of a man who knew what it meant to fight, not for power, but for people. And that's the fire he carried into the next chapter of his life. If you've been moved by Barack Obama's journey so far, from a boy in search of identity to a voice emerging in America's heartbeat, then get ready, because part 4 dives deeper. Behind every speech, every campaign, every handshake, was a man wrestling with something more personal. Let's now explore the heart of the man, his personal philosophy, faith, love, and the quiet battles he fought when no one was watching. This is part 4, Personal Philosophy and Inner Conflicts. Barack Obama has always been admired for his calm, measured presence, but behind that composure was a man deeply conflicted, not because he was dishonest, but because he was deeply, profoundly honest with himself. In a world demanding certainty, Obama carried the burden of nuance. As a community organizer, he had seen raw suffering, broken housing systems, joblessness, families torn apart by a system that seemed deaf to their cries. Activism pulled at his soul. Yet, another force pulled just as hard: diplomacy, strategy. The idea that lasting change came not from shouting into megaphones, but from working rooms of power. The internal tug between those two paths, revolution or reform, was never just political. It was personal. He questioned, could he be a bridge without being a sellout? Could he change the system without becoming it? This philosophical storm found one of its few moments of calm within the walls of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago. It wasn't just about religion. For Obama, faith was identity, community, belonging. The sermons didn't just preach about God. They talked about justice, black dignity, and collective healing. Pastor Jeremiah Wright became a powerful, controversial influence. While some would later weaponize that relationship against him, at the time, Trinity gave Obama something he had never had: spiritual language for his political convictions. But even faith couldn't ease all of the tension. At home, another kind of sanctuary awaited. Michelle Robinson, sharp, grounded, and fearless, wasn't just his partner. She was his mirror. When Barack began to dream of higher office, Michelle saw the cost. Not just the headlines or the grueling hours, but the distance it might create. Between him and their family, between him and himself. She often challenged him, not with anger, but with clarity. Are you doing this for them or for you? Michelle wasn't the political wife, she was the compass, and Barack needed that, because ambition, for all its fuel, comes with shadows. Obama wrestled with that quietly. He worried about ego. He feared being exposed as someone not good enough. Even with degrees from Columbia and Harvard, even after becoming the first black president of the Harvard Law Review, self-doubt clung to him like fog. He would admit in his memoirs that this fear wasn't about failure in the public sense, but about failure of purpose. Would his work actually matter? Could he be enough? Not just for the world, but for the boy he used to be, the one who once looked in the mirror and didn't know where he fit. As the idea of running for office became more real, so did the weight. The choice to enter politics wasn't just a career move, it was a gamble with his soul. And Obama, even then, understood what would be asked of him. To be articulate, but never angry. Confident, but never arrogant. Black, but not too black. Authentic, but always polished. In those quiet nights, often smoking a cigarette on his Chicago balcony, Barack would stare out into the dark and ask himself the questions we all face at some point. Am I ready? What will I lose in the process? Will I still recognize myself at the end? The world would one day know him as No Drama Obama. But before the cool, composed icon, there was the man, balancing faith with fear, purpose with pain, love with legacy. And that's where we leave this chapter, not with answers, but with questions. Because sometimes the most powerful part of a story isn't the victory, it's the vulnerability. Before Barack Obama became a senator or a president, before the crowds, the speeches, or the history books, There was a man trying to make sense of where he came from and what his story really meant. In this chapter, we step into perhaps his most personal endeavour, the writing of Dreams from My Father. Not a political statement, not a campaign strategy, but a raw, unfiltered memoir of identity, grief, searching, and self-reconstruction. This is where the voice of a president was first heard, not at a podium, but on the page. The genesis of a voice. Barack Obama began writing Dreams from My Father in the early 1990s, long before the nation would know his name. The contract came after he became the first black president of the Harvard Law Review, an achievement that put him on the radar of publishers eager for his story. But what he delivered was far from a polished account of triumph. Instead, it was a memoir soaked in uncertainty, loss, and the aching search for meaning. He didn't write it for politics. He wrote it because he had to, because there were ghosts he couldn't bury, questions he couldn't escape, and a silence around his father that had grown too loud. Obama often described writing the memoir as wrestling with the past. It wasn't therapeutic, it was painful. Reopening wounds he had learned to carry quietly. A journey through memory and pain. In Dreams from My Father, Obama paints his life in shades of doubt and contradiction. He doesn't pose as a finished man. He writes as a broken one, trying to piece together what it means to be black, biracial, American, African, an outsider, and a son of a myth. He revisits Hawaii, Indonesia, Chicago, and finally Kenya, each chapter unfolding like a peeling onion, closer and closer to the core. He confesses to adolescent anger, to using marijuana and drifting, to feeling like a cipher in every room he walked into. These were not polished tales for campaign trails. They were confessions, raw and vulnerable. A young man who had spent his life code-switching between cultures, geographies, and expectations, finally speaking in a voice that was truly his own. Why vulnerability mattered. Very few public figures have opened themselves up on the page the way Obama did in Dreams. It wasn't just that he wrote about pain, it was how he wrote about it. With honesty, yes, but also with humility. He didn't justify. He didn't try to resolve every contradiction. He simply laid them bare. He wrote about being ashamed of his own blackness at times, about idolizing a father he barely knew, and then learning hard truths that shattered the myth. He wrote about longing for connection, and constantly running into the reality that identity, for someone like him, would never come neatly packaged. In a world obsessed with image, Obama offered transparency. And that vulnerability, that willingness to bleed a little on the page, gave him something far more powerful than political capital. It gave him a human voice. And it's that voice that would later help millions connect with him beyond policy or politics. The power of storytelling as legacy. Dreams from My Father wasn't just a personal reckoning. It became the blueprint for how Obama would engage with the world as a leader. He didn't lead by dictating truth. He invited people into his search for it. His speeches, his interviews, even his presidency carried that same rhythm of inquiry, of tension, of stories that didn't always have a happy ending. In that way, the memoir was more than just autobiography. It was the origin of his authorial philosophy. That narrative could bridge gaps that statistics could not. That empathy could travel farther than ideology. That people would remember not what you promised, but what you shared. Obama often said, "The stories we tell matter." In Dreams from My Father, he proved it. He told a story that wasn't designed to elevate a candidate, but to reveal a man. And that story, intimate, searching, and honest, became the emotional foundation of his public legacy. The twist. the memoir that predicted the man. Dreams from My Father wasn't just a coming-of-age story. It was a prophecy in disguise. In writing about his broken relationship with his father, Obama would learn how to be present for his daughters. In confessing his own confusion and failings, he would earn the trust of a generation that craved authenticity. And in the quiet isolation of writing, he would forge the language of hope, unity, and resilience, the very language that would carry him to the White House. The world thought Obama's story began when he took the oath of office. But those who read Dreams from My Father knew the truth. The story began long before that, with a lonely young man staring at a typewriter, trying to understand the legacy he had inherited and the one he wanted to create. Up until now, we've walked through the lonely corridors of self-discovery, the boy torn between worlds, the student searching for meaning, the organizer who listened more than he spoke, and the man who questioned whether he was enough. But now, the world begins to notice. We step into part 6, Political Rise, a chapter marked by ambition, electricity, and the quiet threat of resistance. The year is 1996. The South Side of Chicago watches a young Barack Obama step into politics, not as a celebrity, not as a polished icon, but as a man with a clipboard, knocking on doors. The Illinois State Senate wasn't glamorous. The rooms were small. The politics were complicated. Obama entered with ideals shaped by the streets of Roseland and Englewood, only to find himself tangled in the dense backroom machinery of Chicago's political machine, where favors bought votes and vision rarely mattered more than allegiance. He had to learn to play the game without losing his soul. And he did. He listened. He built alliances. He watched, quietly, how deals were struck and power was traded. And slowly, he began to earn respect, not just because he was intelligent, but because he knew how to translate idealism into legislation. But that wasn't enough. He was often the odd one out, too academic for some, too reformist for others. There were whispers, he's too clean. He's not one of us. But Obama wasn't there to be one of them. He was there to change the way politics could feel. The audacity of one night, 2004 DNC speech. Then came the moment that would change everything. The 2004 Democratic National Convention in Boston. At the time, Obama was a relatively unknown Senate candidate, just another name on the lineup, until he opened his mouth. There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. That one sentence cracked open a nation tired of division. With poetic cadence and unwavering clarity, Obama didn't just give a speech. He delivered a sermon for a fractured country. People cried. Networks scrambled to replay the moment. And suddenly, the nation knew his name. It wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration of belonging for millions of people who'd never seen themselves reflected in power. A black man with a Muslim name, raised in Hawaii and Indonesia, was now being hailed as the future of America. Fame, fire, and the speed of ascent. That one night lit a fuse. By November 2004, he was elected as US Senator from Illinois with a landslide. His star rose fast, too fast for some. He went from anonymity to a cultural phenomenon, appearing on Oprah, gracing the cover of Time magazine, and suddenly, every room he entered grew quiet. But with visibility came scrutiny. Inside the Senate chamber, not everyone was cheering. There were murmurs behind closed doors, doubts that he was more celebrity than substance, a man built for headlines, not hard votes. He was called arrogant, presumptuous. Some whispered, he hasn't earned it. The political establishment bristled. Many saw him as a disruptor, a rookie trying to rewrite the rules before learning them. And layered beneath the critiques were the racial undertones that were never said out loud, but always there. He's too smooth, too confident, too polished. Is America ready for someone like him? But Obama knew something they didn't. He knew he had to walk a narrow tightrope, not just between parties, but between black and white, old and young, progress and tradition. He had to be the translator between hope and realism, the resistance within. For all the public praise, behind the scenes, Obama was met with skepticism from both sides, including members of his own party. He didn't fit the mold. He wasn't loud enough for the activists, not cautious enough for the moderates. He was, once again, a man between worlds. But instead of trying to fit in, he began building his own center of gravity. He recruited new thinkers. He traveled to the Midwest, the Deep South, the Rust Belt. He listened to war veterans, single mothers, college kids, and factory workers. He didn't try to become a politician. He tried to become a vessel for stories no one was listening to. And with every handshake and town hall, his message grew stronger. A new kind of politics was possible. Not clean, not perfect, but honest. The storm that followed the light. But fame is a strange thing. It shines bright and casts long shadows. As Obama's star grew, so did the opposition. Conservative commentators called him an empty suit. Far-right outlets spread conspiracies about his faith, his birth, even his loyalties. Obama stood on the precipice of history, and yet, in the eyes of some, he would always be other. Still, he pressed forward. Not because he believed he was destined, but because he believed America was ready, not for him, but for the next chapter. In the quiet between rallies, in the late nights filled with strategy and second-guessing, Barack Obama was preparing for a leap no one thought possible. The journey from Illinois senator to the White House was more than ambition. It was a war between vision and the world as it was. In Part 7, we dive headfirst into that crucible, the historic presidential run. Snow dusted the shoulders of the crowd. It was February 10, 2007, and Barack Obama stood on the steps of the old state capitol, the same spot where Abraham Lincoln once spoke. His voice was calm, deliberate, yet electric. This campaign can't only be about me. It must be about us. Those words weren't just rhetoric. They were prophecy. The birth of a movement. From the moment he announced his candidacy for President of the United States, Obama wasn't just launching a campaign. He was igniting a movement. Yes, we can wasn't a slogan. It was a lifeline for a generation disillusioned by war, economic instability, and divisive politics. Young people, black and white, immigrants, independents, Republicans who felt abandoned. They heard hope in his voice. They saw something rare, belief. But hope, as powerful as it is, doesn't run unchallenged. A nation's skepticism. Many dismissed him at first, a first-term senator, black, with a name that rhymed with Osama in a post-9/11 America. His middle name, Hussein, was weaponized in whisper campaigns. The opposition was fierce, and not just from Republicans. Even within his own party, there were skeptics. Cable news pundits dissected his lack of experience. Political insiders whispered that he should wait his turn. But the crowds kept growing. Iowa, South Carolina, Nevada, state by state, the movement snowballed. They weren't just supporting a man, they were reclaiming belief in something bigger. The machinery versus the movement. Obama ran not against a man, but against the cynicism of American politics, against the machinery that rewarded status quo. While Hillary Clinton leaned on decades of experience and political alliances, Obama built something grassroots, digital, and daring. He redefined campaigning. Emails, YouTube videos, and SMS outreach replaced traditional political leaflets. It wasn't just about raising money, it was about building belonging. And that belonging extended to corners of America that hadn't seen themselves in the White House. Ever. Racism, hate mail, and the threat of hope. But hope has enemies. Obama's team filtered through hundreds of hate messages every day. N-words typed in capital letters, threats to his life, slurs hurled at Michelle and their daughters. The FBI ramped up security. At every rally, the tension simmered just beneath the surface. Obama, ever composed, never let it show. But those close to him knew the toll. What most Americans saw was the smile, the calm. But behind the scenes, he was a man wrestling with the possibility that his dream might get him killed. Michelle's burden. No one carried this weight more than Michelle Obama. She had never signed up to be First Lady. Her mission had always been to protect her daughters and hold the family steady. Now she was in the spotlight. Her every word, outfit, and facial expression dissected and judged. Some media painted her as angry. Others questioned her patriotism. But Michelle was never the caricature they portrayed. She was the anchor. The one who asked the hard questions. Is this worth it? What will it cost us? Behind closed doors, she and Barack wrestled with that question, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in silence. A movement that belonged to everyone. Despite the chaos, Obama never lost sight of the people. He walked rope lines, hugged grandmothers who cried at the sight of him, listened to college students who said they felt seen for the first time. When he spoke, he wove dreams with realism. We are the ones we've been waiting for. It wasn't about him. It was about them. Every town hall, every debate, every interview was another stone in the bridge he was building. A bridge that spanned race, age, gender, and even political ideology. The turning point, Iowa. On January 3, 2008, in the frosty cold of Iowa, Barack Obama won the state caucus. A black man had won a majority-white conservative Midwestern state, not by pandering but by inspiring. The headlines shifted overnight. Can he win? Turned into, he just might. That night, Michelle hugged him a little tighter. Sasha and Malia didn't understand the history they were living, but the world did. The long road to November. The primaries were brutal. The media tried to pit him and Hillary against each other as enemies. But Obama always played the long game. He stayed on message, even when baited. He walked the high road, even when it was lonely. And the people followed. On June 3, 2008, he secured the Democratic nomination. The son of a Kenyan father and a white Kansan mother. The boy who once questioned where he belonged was now one step away from the most powerful office in the world. But the final battle would be the fiercest. Winning the nomination was history, but history doesn't always guarantee victory. Next, we dive into the 2008 election itself, the fire, the fury, and the fight to prove that hope wasn't just a slogan, but a revolution. In Part 8, we follow the final stretch, the race that would change the world. The general election begins. With the Democratic nomination in hand, Barack Obama turned to face his Republican challenger, Senator John McCain. A Vietnam War hero, respected across the aisle and seasoned by decades in the Senate, McCain was no pushover. But this wasn't just a contest of resumes. It was a test of vision, of character, and of how deeply the American people were willing to believe in something new. As summer turned into fall, the stakes soared. America was at a crossroads, 2 wars abroad, a financial crisis at home, and a political landscape thick with distrust. Many asked, was the country ready for a black president? The race tightens. Battleground America campaign headquarters in Chicago morphed into a command center. Staffers lived on caffeine and conviction. Key battleground states, Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, became daily battlegrounds for hearts and minds. Obama crisscrossed the country, holding massive rallies that looked more like rock concerts than political events. But while the enthusiasm was palpable, the campaign's internal motto remained: run like you're 10 points behind. This wasn't arrogance, it was strategy, forged by history and reinforced by the grim knowledge that America, for all its talk of progress, could still recoil from the edge of transformation. The Sarah Palin factor. In an attempt to shake up the race, McCain chose Alaska Governor Sarah Palin as his running mate, a move that electrified conservative voters and brought a surge of media attention. She was bold, charismatic, and instantly controversial. Palin energized the Republican base, but also amplified division. Obama's campaign walked a tightrope. They couldn't appear dismissive or elitist, but they also couldn't allow her rhetoric, often inflammatory, to go unanswered. Instead, they refocused. Policy over personality. Behind the scenes, Obama prepared meticulously for the debates. He understood the risk of coming off as condescending or professorial, but what he feared more was being perceived as angry. Black anger, even when justified, had historically been a disqualifier in American public life. Debates. Calm in the fire. In each presidential debate, Obama brought calm, detail, and clarity. He talked about healthcare, energy, foreign policy. But beyond the content, it was his composure that stunned millions. The stakes weren't just political, they were existential. Every word, every tone, every pause was judged not just by voters, but by a system still hesitant to embrace a black leader. McCain, by contrast, struggled to land a consistent attack. His attempts to tie Obama to radical figures like William Ayers fell flat. When he called Obama "that one" during a debate, many viewers bristled. The tone felt dismissive, even demeaning. Obama didn't bite. He remained centered, confident, and presidential. The financial crisis. A game changer. In September 2008, the financial world cracked open. Lehman Brothers collapsed. Wall Street spiraled. Main Street panicked. Americans watched their 401ks vanish overnight. Fear flooded the economy. This was a defining moment. McCain's response? He suspended his campaign, an unorthodox move that made him appear erratic. Obama, on the other hand, delivered a calm, steady message. Now is the time for leadership. His economic team worked around the clock. He met with Treasury officials and presented reasoned, empathetic plans to stabilize the economy. For many voters, including white working-class independents, this was the moment they took Obama seriously, not just as a symbol, but as a leader. The obstacle of race. Despite momentum, race remained the elephant in the room. Pollsters spoke of the Bradley effect, the idea that white voters would say they supported a black candidate in public but vote differently in private. Obama's team didn't dismiss the threat. They knew every misstep could be magnified by race. They knew that many Americans were waiting for a reason not to trust him. They watched as fringe groups pushed conspiracy theories, birther lies, secret Muslim accusations, and doctored images flooded inboxes and message boards. Michelle Obama bore the brunt too. Every outfit scrutinized, every word weaponized. Her powerful speeches and intellect were twisted into narratives of anger or arrogance. But like her husband, she never buckled. Ground game. The secret weapon. What truly set Obama's campaign apart was its ground game. A digital army of volunteers, organizers, and community leaders mobilized across all 50 states. College students knocked on doors. Retired teachers made phone calls. Immigrant mothers hosted meetups in their living rooms. This was democracy in motion. The campaign's use of data and analytics to target likely voters was groundbreaking. Every donation, every call, every door knock was tracked. It was retail politics, supercharged by technology and guided by purpose. Obama had built something that no one, not even the Clintons, had seen coming. A movement that wasn't just about winning an election. It was about rewriting who America could be. The final days. As Election Day neared, the mood grew electric. In cities and small towns, people lined up for early voting, some waiting 5, 6, even 8 hours. Grandmothers who remembered segregation stood beside teenagers voting for the first time. The polls narrowed in key states. The media hedged, but the campaign never lost focus. On November 4, 2008, America held its breath. Victory. Change has come to America. When the networks called it, there were no words. Barack Obama had been elected the 44th President of the United States, the first black man to do so. CNN flashed a graphic, Barack Obama elected president. Crowds erupted, tears fell. Strangers hugged in the streets of Chicago, Atlanta, Brooklyn, Nairobi, Paris. The world exhaled. In Grant Park that night, standing with Michelle and their daughters, Obama delivered a speech that would echo through time. If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, this wasn't just a win, it was a reckoning with history, pain, promise, and the price of change. What comes next? But history doesn't pause for celebration. While millions rejoiced, others plotted resistance. Some refused to say his name. Others vowed to ensure he'd fail. Obama knew the road ahead would be harder than the campaign that preceded it. But for now, in that moment, standing beneath the lights of Grant Park, the impossible had been done. January 20th, 2009. The cold air wrapped tightly around the steps of the US Capitol as millions gathered to witness a moment once thought impossible. With one hand on the Bible and another in the air, Barack Hussein Obama became the 44th President of the United States and the first black man to hold the highest office in the land. For many, it was history fulfilled. For Barack, it was the beginning of a burden few could comprehend. First term, from crisis to control. As he stepped into the Oval Office, the world was in economic freefall. The 2008 financial crisis had crippled industries, families were losing homes, and the auto industry was teetering on collapse. President Obama's early days were not marked by celebration, but by a scramble to rescue a broken economy. His first major act, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, a nearly $800 billion stimulus package aimed at creating jobs and jump-starting growth. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The bleeding slowed. Then came his moonshot, healthcare reform. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, became the defining battle of his first term. For Obama, it wasn't just policy, it was personal. He'd seen what happened when families couldn't afford care. But the push came at a cost. Dividing Congress, energizing opposition, and sparking a Tea Party rebellion. Still, on March 23, 2010, he signed it into law, expanding healthcare to over 20 million Americans. And just as the political world frothed, the Nobel Committee stunned it. Later that year, Obama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, not for what he had done, but for what he symbolized, a new diplomacy, a new direction. Many saw the gesture as premature. Obama himself admitted surprise. It was a reminder, in power, symbolism and expectation walk hand in hand. Criticism from all angles. But with the highest honor came the harshest criticism. To many on the left, Obama wasn't moving fast enough. Too cautious, too centrist. Why wasn't he closing Guantanamo? Why wasn't Wall Street being held accountable? To the right, he was a radical, an outsider trying to remake America into something unfamiliar. The racist conspiracy theories surged. Birtherism took hold, fanned by media figures and even a future political rival. Worse still, in some black communities, he faced a different critique, that he wasn't black enough. that he didn't speak boldly enough about race or do enough to directly uplift marginalized communities. Obama was trapped in a paradox, praised as a symbol, punished as a man. Every decision was a tightrope. The bin Laden moment. But then came the moment that would redefine his presidency, not in rhetoric, but in resolve. On May 1st, 2011, the world held its breath. In the dead of night, Navy SEAL Team 6 stormed a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Their mission? Kill or capture Osama bin Laden. The man responsible for 9/11 was dead. Obama had made the call. It had been a gamble, militarily and politically, but he had stared down the weight of indecision and moved forward. The image of him, seated in the Situation Room, eyes locked on the operation feed, remains seared into history. It was the moment many saw him, not just as a thinker, but a commander. For once, even critics hesitated. The balance of modern power. But the presidency in the age of social media was evolving fast. Every speech dissected. Every vacation scrutinized. Every crisis a chance for blame. Obama faced the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the rise of ISIS, Ferguson protests, the Sandy Hook massacre. Some moments left the nation grieving, others divided. And always, Obama had to walk the impossible line between empathy and action. And through it all, he began to think about legacy. How would history remember him? As the man who steered America from recession? As the president who made healthcare a right and not a privilege? Or would the promise of hope and change be seen as a dream half fulfilled? The truth, as always, is layered. Barack Obama's first term was not just a test of policy, but of spirit. He had inherited a country broken and hopeful. And in trying to fix it, he carried the weight of centuries, expectations, projections, and dreams stitched into every step. But as the second term approached, it became clear. The fight was far from over. The first term was about breaking barriers, making history, proving that the impossible could be done. But as the euphoria faded, reality sharpened. Re-election wasn't just a mandate, it was a burden. The problems were bigger, the resistance stronger, the stakes higher. And now, Barack Obama had to govern not as a symbol, but as a survivor. In Part 10, we enter the season of reckoning, where power meets its price, and legacy begins to take shape under the weight of expectation. Barack Obama's second term began not with fireworks, but with fatigue. The sheen of history-making had dulled. The crowds were smaller. The chants of "Yes, we can" were now replaced by an impatient whisper. What have you done? This was no longer about symbolism. It was about survival, of ideals, of policies, of a presidency under siege from every direction. The gridlock president's second terms for presidents are rarely kind. For Obama, it was an all-out war of attrition. Congressional gridlock hardened. The House remained in Republican control, and obstruction became the strategy. Legislation stalled. Nominations blocked. Even routine budgets turned into hostage negotiations. And there stood Obama, often alone at the podium, trying to explain why a system built on compromise had turned into combat. He had promised hope, but the machinery of Washington was built on delay, not delivery. Gun violence, Sandy Hook, and the limits of empathy. December 14, 2012, just weeks after his re-election, 20 children were murdered in their classrooms at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Obama wept, not privately, not in silence. He cried in front of the nation, the full weight of fatherhood, presidency, and helplessness on his shoulders. He called for reform. He begged Congress to act. But nothing happened. No assault weapons ban. No new protections. And in that silence, something inside Obama changed. The weight of office had finally broken through the armor. Ferguson, Trayvon, and the new civil rights reckoning. While the nation debated the economy, a different crisis began to boil. Black men were dying in the streets, caught on camera, choked, shot, left bleeding on pavement. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice. Obama walked a political tightrope, careful not to inflame, cautious not to alienate. But to many young activists, it wasn't enough. "Why won't he say it?" they demanded. Black Lives Matter. To Obama, the weight was unbearable. How do you represent all of America when part of America doesn't see you as theirs? When he finally spoke up, calling Trayvon the son I never had, it wasn't just a political statement. It was personal. It was pain. But it cost him support. Right-wing media exploded. Approval ratings dropped. The middle grew colder. Still, he kept going. The power to heal, and the cost. In 2015, a white supremacist walked into a black church in Charleston, South Carolina, and murdered 9 innocent people during Bible study. Obama went to their funeral, and instead of rhetoric, he sang. Amazing grace, raw, off-key, human. The moment stunned the world. He wasn't just a president. He was a mourner, a pastor, a man grieving with a nation torn apart by hate. But these acts of empathy drained him, because every tragedy required him to be more than president. He had to be the nation's soul. Obamacare under fire, again. While the Affordable Care Act had passed in his first term, the battle was far from over. Republicans tried to repeal it over 50 times. The Supreme Court reviewed it. Millions received coverage, but millions more didn't understand it, or outright rejected it. And Obama had to defend the very thing he saw as his greatest legacy, over and over, like a tired parent protecting a misunderstood child. The website launch had crashed, premiums fluctuated, but underneath the chaos, a truth held firm. People were getting help. Still, it was never enough for his critics. They didn't want fixes. They wanted failure. Iran, Cuba, and the foreign policy gamble Obama also used his second term to make bold moves abroad. He opened diplomatic relations with Cuba, ending decades of Cold War silence. He signed the Iran nuclear deal, betting on diplomacy over destruction. He strengthened ties in Asia to counter China's rising influence. But not everyone was on board. Allies grew nervous, enemies grew louder, and at home, conservatives labelled him weak, even dangerous. Yet Obama remained calm, trusting history to be the ultimate judge. Legacy versus lived experience. Obama's second term was about more than power. It was about truth. The truth that no amount of charisma can erase centuries of inequality. The truth that being the first black president meant walking a path no one had paved before, filled with traps, loaded expectations, and invisible burdens. He wasn't perfect, but perfection was never the goal. Dignity was. Grace under fire was. Finishing the race was. By the end of his second term, Barack Obama had grey in his hair, lines around his eyes, and an understanding that few humans will ever grasp. That power without purpose is empty. That legacy isn't written in applause, but in the quiet spaces where history waits to be told. And as he stood before the nation one last time, saying goodbye, he smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because he knew the work had just begun. And now, it was someone else's turn to carry the torch. As the curtain fell on his historic presidency, the world watched Barack Obama take his final steps away from the White House. But was it truly an exit, or the beginning of an entirely different chapter? Let's now explore the story of Obama's life after the presidency. A chapter of reflection, reinvention, and quiet resilience. When Barack Obama left the White House in January 2017, it wasn't just the end of a presidency. It was the closing of a historic chapter, and the world waited to see what he would do next. Presidents typically retreat into memoirs, foundations, or speaking circuits. Obama would do all three, but in his own, quietly transformative way. He started with A Promised Land, the first volume of his post-presidency memoir. It wasn't just a retelling of his time in office, it was a personal excavation. He explored leadership, love, loss, and the soul of America. Critics and fans alike noted how reflective and literary it was. The book wasn't rushed, it was deliberate, and in that slowness, Obama gave himself permission to process, something he rarely had time for in office. But Obama also knew the importance of platforms in the 21st century. He and Michelle signed a massive content deal with Netflix, forming Higher Ground Productions. The goal wasn't just entertainment, it was storytelling with a purpose, amplifying diverse voices, untold histories, and human complexity. Projects like American Factory and Becoming weren't just media hits, they were cultural interventions. He also ventured into podcasting, partnering with Bruce Springsteen for Renegades, Born in the USA, a series that wove together politics, masculinity, race, and music. It was intimate, raw, and human. The cool, calculated Obama that critics once accused of being too aloof was suddenly opening up about vulnerability, friendship, and identity with candor and charm. Beyond media, Obama turned his attention to the next generation. Through the Obama Foundation, he began nurturing young leaders across the globe, particularly those from underrepresented communities. His message was clear: the baton had been passed. He was no longer the face of hope, but the architect behind the scenes helping others carry that flame. Still, his silence was deafening at times. During the Trump presidency, an era defined by political chaos, misinformation, and deeply divisive rhetoric, many wondered why Obama didn't speak out more forcefully. He criticized Trump at key moments, like during the 2020 DNC or in response to the January 6th insurrection, but his restraint baffled some supporters. Was it discipline, respect for tradition, or was it a reflection of internal conflict, knowing that the movement he helped build was unraveling under his successor? Obama's post-presidency hasn't been one of retreat, but of reinvention. He's moved from the spotlight to the director's chair, shaping narrative and nurturing legacy from behind the scenes. He remains a revered figure worldwide, yet polarizing in certain American circles. The mythos has only grown, and yet the man behind it seems more complex than ever. Barack Obama's story is often packaged as the American dream realized. A biracial kid from Hawaii becomes the first black president of the United States. It's a headline that sells. But the truth is messier and deeper. Because for every yes we can, there was a hidden cost. The weight of history, of being the first, was immense. Behind the elegant speeches and global acclaim was a man wrestling with impossible expectations. Obama's ambition, which had propelled him to the highest office in the world, came at a price. Friends from his early activist days said he changed, became more polished, more distant. Not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. The political battlefield required armor. Then there was the toll on his marriage. Michelle Obama has spoken candidly about the strain, how raising two daughters in the White House, while trying to hold on to their identity and partnership, wasn't just difficult, it was exhausting. The spotlight magnifies everything, the flaws, the arguments, the fatigue, and still they endured. Not because it was easy, but because they made it work every day, over and over again. Obama's health also took a hit. The greying hair and increasing gauntness weren't just symbolic of leadership. They were the physical manifestation of stress, compromise, and sacrifice. The job of president ages everyone, but for Obama, it was also about navigating uncharted waters, being the first while having to be perfect. And still, with all he accomplished, From rescuing the economy, to passing healthcare reform, to restoring global alliances, a nagging question lingers. Did he change the system, or did the system change him? To many progressives, Obama didn't go far enough. They wanted structural change, not cautious compromise. To conservatives, he was always too radical. To the people, he was both a savior and a disappointment. It's a cruel paradox. His legacy, while monumental, exists in tension. Was he a myth made real, or a man who couldn't fully live up to the myth he helped create? He gave the world hope, and in return, he absorbed its cynicism. He was called a messiah and a sellout, often in the same sentence. He walked the fine line between inspiration and disillusionment, between leading a nation and carrying its contradictions. And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable twist. Barack Obama remains both revered and resisted. His journey reveals that greatness doesn't guarantee transformation, and that hope, while powerful, is not always enough. Yet even now, when he speaks, people listen. Because deep down, in the messy struggle between idealism and reality, between story and truth, Obama still represents a rare thing in politics: the belief that we can be better than we are.